Hi, you're listening to Scribble Talk Teaching, a podcast for bid and proposal professionals. My name is Bhaskar Sundram, and I'll be sitting down with the industry veterans to dive deep into the topics that business-winning professionals like you can help to grow your skills and also your business. Today's guest is Chris Whyatt, and our topic is co-creation process, structure of the frameworks, and the results that's delivered. Over the last 20 years, or more than that 20 years, Chris has actually co-created business-winning frameworks with a wide variety of global organizations, including Adobe, Aptuit, BNFL, ComputerLand, Getronics, ICM, Lotus, Microsoft EPG, Nice System, Pitney Bowes, Royce, Ultra Airport Systems, Virtual Clarity, and many more. Chris will be talking us through the co-creation process, the structure of the frameworks, and the results delivered, including any interesting stories along the way. We have hosted a few times, so Chris, welcome back to Scribble Talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Chris, talk us through the journey of co-creation, talk us through some of the frameworks, and we'll just go one by one.
Okay, thank you. Yes, when I set up Practical Bid Solutions, my old company in sort of 1999, and started working for people doing bids and so on, I moved into sort of bid improvement kind of stuff. And what became obvious, working with a lot of these people, would be that they didn't have, for want of a better word, a process, like you'd have a project management process. And I use the word process deliberately because they didn't, that's what they didn't have. And I can't remember really which was the first one I probably did. I've written down, as I said to you before, sort of a chronology of the ones I've done, and I've got copies of all these things. Now, the first thing I must say is that when I work with these organizations to co-create these, I always worked on the understanding that the IP belonged to the company, because I'd get people saying, well, why don't you just give me the process you created for company X, company Y, and company Z? And A, I can't because it belongs to company X, Y, or Z. But B, what works for one organization doesn't necessarily work for another. So I would always start from scratch with each one. So really, I think the most useful thing to do is talking about how how the starting from scratch process worked. And what the starting point was always, what have you got already that works, that you use? Because the whole idea of ripping up what somebody's always done and starting again is never a good idea, because A, you lose the good stuff, but you also alienate people. So I always did these as workshops, and I would get the company to give me probably 6 stakeholders from across the business, and we'd always start by agreeing why we were there. So what's the objective? And we'd spend some time working on an objective for what we were trying to create. And I won't give what we're trying to create a label at the moment. I'm just looking in my folder here. Now, where are we? So I did one for a company called ICM, and it was a major bids process, because that's what we decided to call it. And the objective was to qualify, plan, and manage major bids to a successful conclusion in a cost-effective manner, and to apply the lessons learned. So as a group, we workshop that. It could be half an hour, And the objective of the overall process was to qualify, plan, and manage major bids to a successful conclusion in a cost-effective manner and to apply the lessons learned. Now, I think that was pretty good. The one I did with Microsoft, the Enterprise Partner Group, to ensure that Microsoft and its partners work together to qualify, plan, manage, and deliver must-win opportunities, in quotes, to a successful conclusion in a consistent and cost-effective manner and apply the lessons learned. So some similarities there, and you'll notice that in each one of those cases, the last bit of it is and apply the lessons learned. So continuous improvement was a really important theme. So when we'd agreed an objective that everybody in the room was happy with, and the way I sold the objective was that I want you people, guys and gals, to go out and talk to your colleagues about what we're doing. And when you're explaining it to them, the obvious thing to start with is an objective. So in these frameworks that I've created, and I've introduced the word framework there because even though some of the earlier ones were called process is a word that a lot of people resist. Whereas if you have a framework and they can be identical, people feel that a framework is something you dip in, dip out of when you need to, whereas a process is something you follow rigorously. So using the terminology framework always softened the blow for people. So I use that. So what we do once we'd agreed the objective, and normally these sessions, which I would facilitate, would be half a day maximum. And we do what I would call, well, what I do call the level one stuff. So the level one stuff was, okay, the sort of start and end point. So if you're going to have a structured framework, there's something you do first and there's something you do last. And there are things that you do in between the first and last thing to get to the end goal. And the way we used to define those level one things was normally I would get the people in the room to talk me through the best win the company had ever had. So they'd all agree that it was this deal with this customer. And then I would get them to discuss amongst themselves what they did from discovering the opportunity to closing the deal. And I would make notes on a flip chart, if people remember them, or a whiteboard or whatever, and just put down sort of 2 or 3 words that captured each of the sort of stages that they went through. So we identified the opportunity, we qualified it hard, you know, we dived deep into the customer requirements, and then we started, you know, storyboarding, then we started developing a proposal, then we reviewed the proposal, then, you know, I'm just bringing random things up here. So when they talk through this perfect opportunity, and I was sort of just on the periphery listening to this, I would capture this, we did this first, and then we did that, and then we did that. And those normally come up to sort of maximum of about 10 different things. And I will then say to them, right, that's been fantastic listening to. So in summary, looking at this flip chart, you did this, then you did this, then you did this, each with 2 or 3 word descriptors, and you won the perfect deal. Yes, okay. So let's just play a game here. Think of the worst loss you've ever had. Oh, haha, that's easy, but it could be this one, it could be that one. And let's just go through the process that I've written down here, or the stages I've written down here, and you talk what through amongst yourselves, and you know, so I can listen in what you didn't do, and they'll laugh and they go, oh yeah, we didn't do that at all. Oh, and there was no proposal planning, and then proposal, yeah, and there was no review of the proposal, and oh, I don't know, there was no sign off, and oh, this was late, that was late. So I would sort of say, so is it fair then, guys and gals, to say that the stuff that's up on the board here, which is what you did do when you won your best deal and what you didn't do when you lost the one that you really should have won, does that capture the sort of soup to nuts of what you do? Yes. So what I do is I would call a halt to the workshop then, and when I would close the first workshop, I'd say that within an hour I was going to send them a document with just a PDF with the objective of what we were trying to create and the key stages that they were suggesting had worked for them in the past. And obviously, I would probably at times question what they were doing to get the language right. And if they were using a sales methodology, quite typically 20 years ago, Miller-Hyman, I would tend to adopt that kind of language. And what I would tell them to do would be to identify people in their immediate circle of colleagues to take this PDF to and say, look, I'm working with this external consultant. We're producing this framework. This is how far we've got at the moment. This is the objective of the framework. And these are the high-level stages of the framework. So given what I said to them as well was that they should have a minimum of 5 people each. So there were 6 people in the room, and those 6 people each had to go and talk to 5 different people and explain what we'd done to date. And we'd arrange a second meeting, which would be no less than a week later, for another half-day session. And in the meantime, I would then send the PDF out. And the instructions for everybody were, go and talk to these other people and come back with the sort of printed piece of PDF with notes on. So what this did was really play to this sort of co-creation thing, was that they went and talked to their peers, and that was, 30 people, 30 other people outside the 6, to validate what they were doing and to get feedback from what they were doing and give those people a voice in the co-creation of the process. And then we'd meet again a week later with everybody bringing their notes back from the level 1 an objective discussion, and we'd review those notes and make whatever changes we needed to make to that sort of level 1 stuff, the sort of the stage names. And then we'd look at the level 2 stuff. And the level 2 stuff was the objective of each of the stages. So just like the overall framework had an objective, there would be an objective for each stage. So looking at one of the ones here, the objective of the qualify and invest stage was to ensure an opportunity is good business in quotes, and that we can win at an acceptable cost to the business. So the first stage of this framework was qualify and invest, and the objective of the stage was this. And we do that for each of the different stages in the framework, so that we're all on the same page about what we wanted to achieve with that stage. We then establish who were the owners of each of the stages, because somebody had to drive each of the stages. And in that case, that one was a salesperson. And what the input was, in this case, it was the customer opportunity and or tender documents, because some bids or some proposals don't have a customer document to respond to, do they? So we'd agree the objective, the owners and participants, the inputs and the outputs. So, you take the opportunity, the customer opportunity and or tender documents, and then the output of that stage would be approval to bid from whoever. And that is what I call the level 2 stuff. So each stage has an objective, an owner and participants, an input and an output. And what we'd spend the second workshop doing is defining each of those. And obviously, the output from the one stage is often the input to the next stage, or one of the input to the next stage. So we define that level 2 stuff probably again, the 6 of us plus me, in a couple of hours, and we just repeat the process. I would document it before I left the building. Send the PDF out with the level 2 stuff in on top, underneath the level 1 stuff. We'd have a new meeting arranged for a week's time, and we'd, they go and talk to their peers. I call them peer reviews. The next meeting, which was the third meeting, we'd go through and review the feedback, make changes to the level 1 and level 2 stuff, and then start defining the level 3 stuff. And the level 3 stuff was the actual activities it took to turn the input into outputs. And I call them activities. So the first one of this process I'm looking at here, framework, is review tender against qualification criteria. And part of the project was to create some qualification criteria. Then it was repeat. The next activity was repeat process with sales manager. The next one was clarify with customer if necessary, and then book a slot at the next review board, which were held once a week. And each of these activities, some of these activities were actual gates. So some were meetings and some were gates and some were things you had to do. So in each stage, there were go, no go points. So you were constantly requalifying the opportunity and could stop at any time. And then guess what? When we've done the level 3 stuff, I got it all up on a PDF and people went and did peer reviews. And the 4th meeting would result in a framework that had the objective, the level 1 stuff reviewed by 30 people plus the 6, the tier 2 stuff the same, and the level 2 stuff and the level 3 stuff. So in 4 meetings of half a day, we've got through right down into the detail of who does what, where and when, and what the gates are and so on. And it's been reviewed by 30 people outside the 6 people. So 36 people in the organization have actively had a voice and contributed to the co-creation of the framework. And it worked really well. There was an example of one company that I'll tell you the little story, where we'd arranged to meet in the morning, and then there was a sort of buffet lunch for everybody who'd been involved, and then including the 30 people, none of whom I had met ever. And then straight after lunch at 2:00, we, having printed copies of this off on an A3 paper over lunch, the team presented the framework back to all the employees. And I would always sit at the back of the room and not be actively involved in presenting the framework to the employees, because I didn't want people to associate the framework with an external consultant who, when he left, meant that we didn't have to use the framework anymore. Does that make sense?
Totally, Chris, totally. I think, the way you explained day 1, day 2, day 3, 4, and the different types of companies, how you approach them, totally. Please continue.
Okay, good. So I think the first one I did that I actually remember was a company called ComputerLand, who were in Nottingham. And I don't remember how it came about, but I went to do this for them and did it in exactly the way I've described for you. And virtually the moment we finished it, they had an opportunity for Manchester City Council for the desktop outsourcing. So it's an IT company, and Manchester City Council, I think, had 14,000 desktops, and they were going to outsource the whole thing to another company. ComputerLand bid, Computer Centre bid, SCC bid. I think that was it. I think Computer Centre or SCC were the incumbents, and ComputerLand won it. And I wasn't actually actively involved in the bid, but a friend of mine, Matthew, was involved. And it was a complete revelation to them to A, knock out the incumbent, but B, to Computer Centre and SCC, who were probably the most obvious people to get this deal done. And when they won, I happened to be in the office that day in Nottingham, and there were people running around hugging each other and high-fiving and going completely nuts. And I was obviously pleased for them. And I made a suggestion that I went and did an independent debrief, because the one thing I've not mentioned is that the last stage of each of these frameworks is always called review and learn or continuous improvement, which means that you have to have some kind of debrief with the customer and internally. So I suggested I went and did that for them. And I went to Manchester City Council, and they organised a meeting room, and the 6 evaluators came in, and sat down and talked to me. And I said, I don't work for ComputerLand, but I'm here as an independent to understand A, what they did well, and B, what they could have done better. And it was very interesting because they talked among themselves, and they said that ComputerLand had religiously followed the process every way, every requirement that the ITT said, including, maximum number of pages for this. And this is 20 years ago, mind you. And one of the people said that at the customer presentation, you were allowed a maximum of 30 slides and only 3 about you as an organization, as a supplier. And she said that other suppliers didn't follow those guidelines, and the ComputerLand did. And it was the last 3 slides that were about ComputerLand, not the first 3, which they thought was really fantastic. And I'll never forget the defining moment was a woman. There was only one woman in the 6 evaluators. She said, "I've just realized that what did it for me was that the proposal felt like it was written for us." And I thought, wow, that's so powerful. I said, "I understand totally what you mean, but can you just explain that?" She said, "Everything I read was all about us and what we wanted and our concerns and the risks to us and the problems. And it felt like they'd really got under our skin and what we were trying to achieve and what we wanted. And there was no corporate BS in there," and everybody laughed. And she said it just felt like it had been written for us. And all the other people in the room started talking about that. "Oh yeah, and I love this bit where they did this, and this was really clever." And it was just amazing. So I went back to ComputerLand presented the results back and said, "Well done," and gave them feedback. And they were really, really thrilled. And they said, "So what's the takeaway from this?" And I said, "The takeaway from this is never let anybody copy that proposal. Because if it felt like it was written for us, i.e. Manchester City Centre, it's not going to work in Birmingham or Newcastle or any other city." So it was a really good, and it was great for me because I was actually around when they applied the framework, and I've got the framework in front of me here now. They applied the framework and they won a deal, and I was able to go and do the debrief. So that was really good. And Matthew Cooper and I have stayed in touch ever since. Not long after that, in 2004, we got an opportunity to work with an organization called BNFL. And younger members of listening to this won't remember BNFL, but it was British Nuclear Fuels Limited, and it was the government-owned people who ran all the nuclear power stations. And they got my company, Practical Bid Solutions, in. And it didn't hurt that we were about 10 miles from their head office, I have to add, for a very broad project, which was the commercialization of BNFL, make them, because they were handed work by DTI, they didn't have to bid for work. So myself and my colleagues helped them commercialize. And in that, we created a framework, which is one of the ones that I posted on LinkedIn before, and I will post again. And I created it with a young friend of mine at the time, Dave Clark, who was is a really tremendous guy. And that had a big impact on BNFL and created a lot of sort of worksheets to go under that about developing win strategies and win themes and analysing risk. But again, that was all co-created, which was rather difficult because they'd never bid before. But I wanted to help them create something that they felt they owned, not that we'd imposed on them as consultants. So there was a lot more of us guiding them through what a good framework looked like, and very enjoyable project. And then that same year, when we finished BNFL, I was asked to go and talk to De La Rue Cash Systems. And De La Rue, if people don't know, were the people who used to print money and print passports. They made machines to count money, and they destroyed money when it was no longer, usable because money wears out, and they destroyed it. Fascinating company with connections to the Channel Islands where I was born. And when I went to De La Rue initially, it was because they'd had 3 profit warnings in 6 quarters, and the chief exec, whose name escapes me, Mr. Much. Anyway, he left because they'd had 3 profit warnings in 6 quarters. And I looked at the way they did bidding, and a very good friend of mine from APMP, Giles Carter, worked there, and I worked with him, and there was nothing wrong with the way they did bidding. It was really very good. And when I presented back to them, I said, well, thank you for giving me the gig, but I honestly can't fault the way you do bids. And in fact, it's some of the best stuff I've ever seen. But I said, if I can just say on my last slide that I think where you're going wrong and why you've got the profit warning problems is you don't have an opportunity management framework, which is broader than a bid management framework, because it takes, suspect to prospect to the whole Miller Hyman soup to nuts sort of thing. And Kevin Bond, who was the head of sales, really, yes. Oh no, he was the MD of De La Rue Cash Systems in the UK, Kevin Bond, yeah. He said, okay, well, will you help us create an opportunity management process? And how would you do that? And I explained it in the way that I explained things to you. But because it was broader than just sales, we had people who worked in the factory, we had commercial people, we had sales people, we had bid people, we had lots of different people working on creating what became the opportunity management framework. And again, that had stage descriptions, which were based on Miller Hyman again. There was an objective, so inputs and outputs, and done again in a sort of matrix type way, which people will see when we get this up on LinkedIn. And I remember going to the Portsmouth office one day and going onto the factory floor, into the room they always have on a factory floor where the operations manager is. And I sort of knocked on the door and went in. It was glass panels all around so we can see what was going on in the factory. And he said, I'm glad you're here. I said, oh, good. Why? And he said, I've just had a fax from our salespeople in, let's call it Ecuador, saying that a bank in Ecuador wants to buy 12 machines to count money, and they need them a week on Friday. This is the first I've ever heard about this deal. And the salesman's already been on the phone today saying, have you got the order? Can you get this done in this time? He said, unfortunately, last Friday, because there's no demand for these machines anymore, I sent all the OEM spares back. I made people redundant who make the machines because we don't make them anymore because there's no demand. I was told there were no orders in the pipeline. So we don't have the spares, we don't have the people, and I can't fulfill the order. And he said, the work we're doing is going to stop that happening. So we again followed the process you described earlier, and that framework was published. And the stages were identify suspect, qualify prospect, establish trust and credibility, which is a Miller Hyman thing, understand and influence the requirement, finalize the solution, propose and present the solution, close the sale, do the order intake, i.e. take the order from the customer and give it to fulfillment, and then review and learn. And when it was done, we created, 50 posters, one of which I still have in my loft, of A0 size posters with the framework on. And they virtually redecorated De La Rue Cash Systems with these posters, just so that they became part of the sort of consciousness of the people who were doing the job every day. And when I left, when I'd finished working with them on the project and the thing was launched, they, as far as I can remember, they didn't have another profit warning. And I remember getting a phone call from somebody there one day saying, oh, our results are coming out tomorrow. And I said, oh, in my naivety, what are they? And he said, I can't tell you, because if I did, that's insider trading. And I said, oh, yeah, that's good. He said, but all I'll say is watch out for the results. And you should be very proud because it was implementing the framework that you helped us create that made the difference. We don't have any profit warnings anymore because we have got a solid pipeline. Everybody's aware of only the good stuff's in the pipeline. We're not running around chasing half-baked opportunities. We're much more streamlined and much more focused. And it was good. And in fact, they took the framework I'd used to capture all their input and created another framework to follow it that went from order intake through to the commissioning of the kit with the customer and the ongoing support and maintenance and so on. So they had effectively two frameworks that did everything from identifying suspects to review and learn. Not long after that, I did one with Getronics at the behest of my friend Nick Ayton. And the year that we co-created that, I did go to the launch of that and stood at the back of the room. And I was introduced as the chap at the back is the guy who helped us or facilitated the creation of this framework. And that felt good. Anyway, the guys are presenting the framework to about 100 people in this meeting room at Getronics. And somebody said after about 3 minutes, can I ask a question? And they went, okay, go on. He said, to me, it looks like you've kept all the good stuff that we do and then filled in the gaps or replaced stuff that we don't do well. So basically, it's what we already do, but just sort of souped up and improved and blah, blah, blah. And one of the guys presenting the framework said, got it in one. And you could see everybody in the room just went from having their arms folded, looking tense, to, wow, this is great. And they really engaged and embraced it. And we implemented some really good stuff there. There was a weekly panel that you could take opportunities to get an investment. And it was the Getronics UK Opportunity Management framework. And I've got a copy in front of me. It was issued in July 2005. And it was a big success, I have to say. But again, it was that same process of co-creation. I was the facilitator. I would say to people always, we have to have this review and learn at the end. And if I thought that they'd missed something, I would always subtly suggest that there were things that they'd missed and they needed to, what about doing this here? What about doing this here? Don't you think we ought to have a gate here? So I wasn't completely passive. I wasn't just scribing or scribbling even. There was a joke there, by the way. So Getronics was a really good one. Did one with Adobe after that. There was a company called Aptuit that do clinical trials for new drugs coming to market. And that was good, took me into a whole new market. I then went and did some work with Microsoft Enterprise Partner Group in Reading and created a framework there. The Ultra Electronics, that's right. A friend of mine ran Ultra Airport Systems and we created a framework there. And we did a very interesting piece of work at the front end about all opportunities are not equal. So each opportunity was classified by offer type and customer type. So they would prioritize things and change the priorities based on who the customer was. Were they a strategic customer, a growth customer, or a target customer, and which of their product lines, of which they had 7, it was. So that sort of front end chose what went in. Again, creating or co-creating more frameworks. And probably to sort of bring you up to speed, in 2016, I did some work with a company called Nice Systems in London and did some work that I referenced in the last talk that you and I did together about overcoming resistance to change. And out of that, it turned out that very few people understood what everybody else did in the organization. And if you think about an organization, it's all moving parts and there's interdependencies everywhere. And I created something there called Glue, and it was called Glue because it was how we work together to deliver customer excellence. So Glue is the thing that holds it all together. So I called the framework Glue, and that again, I was looking at it earlier on today, was a poster job, and it said at the bottom, compiled by Chris Whyatt of Get to Great Then, with help from, and all a list of the people who helped create it. And there was a chap in Nice Systems who said to me, he was very senior, he said, I really like this Glue thing. He said, but I don't really understand the point. He said, I sort of get the point, but I can't see the value of having this all documented. And he had a meeting room, and it was on the wall next to the table where he did all his meetings. So he came away from his desk and sat at his table and did meetings. And this is an A0 poster, so like a big movie poster with all this stuff on. And I said to him, okay, that's a very good question. But I'm going to answer a question with a question. How many meetings have you had with customers, your colleagues, partners, where you've not referred to the poster on the wall next to your desk to make a point? And he said, that's a very good question. Never. I don't think I've ever had a meeting where I've not gone and said, look, and pointed at something and said, that's where we are. This is what needs to be done. Has this been done? This is what needs to be done next. And I thought that was a really sort of ringing endorsement for that kind of, a framework like that. I've done a couple of other ones since, for one for G2 Speech and one for another company, that were very sort of simple projects. And sort of my contribution was something like 5 days work. But both the frameworks that I created then were business winning frameworks, beyond sort of bidding, into the broader context of business winning. And they both been very successful. But I was trying to think. I think the biggest one of these that I've ever done was, I can't think, probably the BNFL one, and that was 10 days of my time. Most of these were 5 days of my time, because if you think about it, I had 6 people in every workshop as a minimum. We had, each of those 6 people had 5 peers who reviewed everything. So it wasn't like we were producing this thing in secret. At most of the launches, 35 or 40 people in the room felt a degree of ownership because they'd helped create the thing. And I think the key points here is that people like, if you call something a framework or create the identical thing and call it a process, you'll have more success with the thing called a framework than you will with a process, because people just find framework a more acceptable word. The co-creation thing is essential. Don't chuck away the good stuff that people have got. And none of the frameworks I've ever created would have worked for any of the other organizations, if you understand me. And I think the communication part, creating a poster. So what I normally do is, because I'm involved in the sort of communication of it, is sort of create A4 copies, A5, A4 copies, A3 copies, A2 copies, A1s and A0s, and just paste the building. I mean, I did one with VMware where they already had a sales methodology or a sales process, and I just captured it all on one page and produced it all on posters. And people were saying to me, what is that? And I said, that's your sales process. I've never seen it before. Well, that's because it's in a folder on a server somewhere called sales process, and nobody ever looks at it. But, I've now captured all that on one page and put it in a poster so that everybody can use it. And that was part of a project I talked about on our last thing, Destination 1 billion, and they got to $1 billion, so it worked. I think that's really, hopefully, I've summed up how I do it, who I've done it for, some of the results, what the key points are. If you can't say it on a page, doesn't mean you can't have a detailed guide beneath that, but you've got to be able to articulate it on a page. And I will put some examples on LinkedIn when you post this talk, if that's okay.
Definitely.
you.
I think, you have at least given 15 plus examples here, Chris. But what do you think is the common underlying problem each of those frameworks that you created specifically for this companies address? Is there any commonality?
What, in terms of the problems it solves?
Yes.
I think, yes, I think it gets rid of the, in the world of sales, people say sales is an art, not a science. Well, it's an art and a science. And I think it puts some structure behind the way people work. And the argument I would have is that you wouldn't implement a customer solution without using a proper project management methodology or framework, would you? No. So how do you expect to win business doing things in a sort of haphazard way and in an unstructured way? But, well, why do you do that in an unstructured way? But then when you win it, it's all about structure and process and who does what at what time, project management sort of principles. And I just think it's putting more structure so that everybody knows, if they don't know already, what to do. I'll give you an example. I went to see somebody once and they said, "Oh, it all sounds great, Chris, but we don't need help. We've already got a process." And I would always say, "That's fantastic. And, I'm sorry to have wasted your time coming to see you to talk to you about this. Could I have a look at it? It would, I'd be happy to run my eyes over it if you like." "Oh, well, it's not actually documented. It's in everybody's head." I tried not to do what you did there. And I said, "Yeah, but everybody's interpretation will be different. And if it's in everybody's head, that's great. Why don't you give me half a dozen people for a day and we'll take all that stuff out of their heads and stick it on a poster?" Because I used to carry the folder that I've got here now next to me. And I sort of, flash examples up. I said, I could capture all that stuff that's in their head and put it in a poster. And the guy said, "Well, how much is that going to cost me?" Boom. "Oh, okay, right, fine, yeah." And we did it. So I think it adds sort of structure, visibility to everything. I know bid, from my 20 years plus in APMP, that bid people always struggle with this sort of recognition and being undervalued and underappreciated. And, what value do you add? You're an overhead kind of stuff. Why can't we just use an old proposal? And I think this gives them something to point at that says, look, this is simple. This is what I want you to do. Because I often color code them. And I say, anything in purple, the salespeople do. And the salespeople say, well, there's only 6 things on the whole framework that's got my name on, i.e. that's in purple. Who does the rest? Well, that's why you have bid teams and solution architects and subject matter experts. If you do those 6 things at the right time, oh, it's a lot simpler than I thought. Oh, I thought it'd be really complicated, blah, 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 blah. So I think that's the problem it solves. And many years ago, I went back to Ultra Airport Systems in another guise and went into a meeting room to talk about something. And one of the people in the meeting knew I'd been involved in creating their business winning framework. And I think possibly, I don't know if they were in, but it was still up on the wall in a frame. It was like a framed picture on the wall. The whole framework was framed, sorry. And there was a credit at the bottom compiled by Chris Whyatt with help from blah, 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 blah. And the guy said, "Oh, I thought you might enjoy that." And everybody else in the room was like, what are you talking about? And they said, "Oh, this is Chris Whyatt." And people went, oh, I thought we created that. And I said, "You did." I said, "But somebody had to pull it all together." And yeah, it was nice. It's nice to go back and people remember these things. And one place I went to, I got some work. They rang me up and said, could you? It was somebody I'd worked with before in another company. And he said, "I'll be honest with you, I nicked the framework from the other company where we worked together. And I've tried to implement it here and it just doesn't work here. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to pay you to develop a new one because I can't nick the one from the old company. I said, well, you're very naughty nicking it. And obviously it's not going to work because it's not the same company, is it? So yeah, anyway, I hope that answers your question. But they're great fun to do because the people I work with are always great. Peer review thing is really, really powerful because I can't get round to 30, 40 people, but the people who do, the 6 or 7 people I get in the room, it gives them a chance. They should be explaining it to other people, not me, shouldn't they?
100%, Chris. Chris, one question that pops up all the time when you talk about processes, we follow Shipley process, for example, or we follow APMP process. I'm sure you might have come across that word, and then you go back and look, they don't do that, or they might have taken elements of Shipley or APMP. What will be your response? What will be your advice of people who are saying, hey, we are going to follow a generic blueprint process?
I think I always start the projects like this by saying, what do you use already? Do you have, and if they say it's Shipley or it's Miller-Hyman or it's strategic selling framework or whatever they use. So I say, so we need to reflect that in what we're doing, because otherwise we'll alienate people. So what I don't want to hear people say is, didn't we used to call that something else and you've just changed the language? So if they've got a common language and a common structure and a common process, I will always make sure we use that, because it makes adoption easier. But the biggest enemy of all quote unquote processes is adoption. You create these things and people don't use them, or people don't understand that they exist. And this is why I'm a massive fan of the posters, and this is why I've still got the posters. And obviously I can't use them again, and they shouldn't be used again, but I can't let go of them. And I say I've got 2 framed ones in my loft and the rest of them here on A3s. And I'll get my wife to take some more pics of me holding them. But so people can get an idea of what they look like without looking at the content.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris. Chris, I think, this talk you just went through, your experiences, is many people's age, as I call it. I think every company that you touched, and with the nuances of each of those companies, the co-creation process and the related workshops and how to conduct workshops, difference between process and frameworks, and the kind of research that was delivered, etc. It should definitely inspire a few people to go back and look at their process and frameworks to say, hey, is there anything that I could improve from here? I think definitely that's really insightful, Chris. Any final thoughts before we close the episode, Chris?
No, I don't think so. I mean, people can feel free to ring me up when they've listened to it and ask me clarification points, or ask clarification points via you. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to send them copies of stuff that I've done, but I'm more than happy to answer questions. And whatever way you want to do it.
Perfectly fine, because as you rightly said, even though the principles could be the same, the processes are actually specific for individual companies, and you'll be more than happy to share the principles rather than the actual process. You are very clear from the beginning, and let's just keep that in mind when anybody reaching out to you as well. So that's it. Thank you so much, Chris, for your time today. I think would love to host you as many times possible, because it's amazing how much experience you have got, all the stories and experiences. Let's document it. But until then, stay healthy, stay happy, continue to inspire us, Chris, and we will keep you posted when it goes live. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, listeners. Take care.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.
To our listeners, thank you so much for tuning in. Please visit batchyscribble.com/podcast to listen to this episode and check out any of our other previously recorded episodes. If you've enjoyed today's interview, don't forget to subscribe, review, and share the Scribble Talk podcast. We hope you'll check out our next episode, where we interview another industry expert and special guest. Until then, it's Ashley Kays,
Pastor Sundram,
signing off.